Buffalo wants Darren Payne. Fine. The problem is the price they're willing to pay, and when I tell you the number, you're gonna understand exactly why Adam Peters shouldn't even pick up that phone. But there's something else in this story nobody's talking about. There's one very specific scenario where Peters should listen, and the conditions for that scenario to happen change everything about this analysis. Meanwhile, DYAMI Brown is back in Ashburn, and the people who were at every OTA rep this spring have a straight up declaration about where he stands in this receiver room right now. There's a name, there's a number, and there's a tactical argument behind Brown that the national media still hasn't figured out. I'm going to break it down for you, and I'm also going to tell you why there's a real reason to worry that nobody's putting on the table. And Will Harris is 30 years old, fractured his fibula in week 3. He's in the last year of his deal with no guaranteed money left, and he's got one training camp to convince Durante Jones he still has a role in this defense. What very few people are saying is what happens exactly if he doesn't convince him, and who steps in. Raise hail. Okay, there is a lot of context to unpack here before I give you my opinion, so stay with me. Isaac Zuniga over at Heavy.com published a piece this week called 3 Veterans the Bills Could Trade for Before the 2026 Season. Darren Payne made the list. And look, Zuniga's argument from Buffalo's side is not wrong. Josh Allen just turned 30, entering his 9th NFL season. Allen himself said publicly this week that he is hoping the dad strength kicks in after crossing 30. The Bills are in a contention window. They need interior pass rush. Payne would plug in immediately next to their defensive line and give Josh Allen a better defense to work with. All of that is accurate. But then we get to the number. Listen to me. The projected trade cost that Heavy.com put on Darren Payne, one of the most consistent defensive players this franchise has produced in the last decade. The guy who had 11.5 sacks in 2022 and spent 6 years being the only real interior threat on this defensive line, is a 5th round pick in 2027. A 5th round. Bro, I need a second with that. That is not an offer. That is a number you put on paper when you hope the other side is not paying attention. And before anybody in the comments tells me, but his cap hit is enormous and his numbers have been down, let's actually walk through all of that, because the real analysis of this situation is way more interesting than what Heavy.com is suggesting. First, the real numbers. Per SpotRack, Darren Payne carries a cap hit of $27.9 million in 2026. That includes a base salary of $16.4 million, a $5 million roster bonus, and the workout bonus. That cap hit is real. It is the highest on the Commanders roster right now. Nobody is going to argue with that. And ESPN's John Keim reported this week that Adam Peters made it clear from early in the offseason that the only extension Washington is negotiating this year is Laramie Tunsil's. Payne plays out his deal, period. Peters said the front office wants to wait until after the 2026 season to discuss any extension because they want to see how Payne fits in new defensive coordinator Durante Jones's defense. That is a calculated decision, not a sign of disinterest in keeping him, and here is where I push back hard on the idea that Payne is some kind of finished product the team should move off cheap, because there is one data point that almost nobody is putting at the center of this conversation. The only year Darren Payne played in a 3-4 base defense in his NFL career was 2022. He had 11.5 sacks that year. That was his Pro Bowl season. That was the year that put him in the conversation for best interior tackle in the league. After that, he played 3 seasons in a 4-man front on a defense that repeatedly finished among the worst in the NFL collectively. No exterior pass rush generation. No safety help behind him. No defensive coordinator capable of putting him in favorable leverage situations. And even then, in 2025, playing 9 of 15 games, Payne still produced 3 sacks, 7 tackles for loss, a forced fumble, and 5 passes defended. Those are not numbers from a player who has nothing left. Those are numbers from a player whose scheme has been working against him for 3 years. Now, I am going to be honest about the legitimate concerns because I am not here to be blind about this. The real question about Darren Payne in 2026 is not whether he can still play in the NFL. That is settled. The question is whether he has the same explosiveness he showed in 2022, or whether 6 years of anchoring a struggling defensive line took something out of him physically. That is a fair question. Peters has it. Jones has it. That is exactly why they are waiting to see him in pads at training camp before committing more money. But think about the full picture. The Commanders have Javen Kinlaw on a $30 million 2-year deal. They have Jerzan Newton entering year 3, a player who put up 3 sacks on Christmas Day against the Cowboys last year and wants more snaps. There is legitimate interior depth now that did not exist 2 seasons ago, and Durante Jones is installing the same 3-4 system that gave Payne 11.5 sacks in 2022. If Peters sells Payne in July for a 5th round pick, and Payne goes to Buffalo and dominates next to their edge rushers, Peters owns that decision. And this fan base, rightly, will never let him forget it. There is also a cap mechanics angle that nobody is talking about. If Washington cuts Payne before the season, they absorb $16.2 million in dead cap. If they trade him, the receiving team takes on the remaining contract. That means any trade partner needs to be willing to absorb almost $28 million in cap space, not just send picks. The Bills have the space. That is not the obstacle. The obstacle is that a 5th round pick in 2027 does not come close to compensating for the risk of losing your most consistent interior tackle in the one season where he finally gets to play in the scheme that produced the best football of his career. My position is clear. This trade does not happen before training camp. It does not happen in August. If it happens at the October trade deadline, and only under 2 specific conditions. First, the Commanders are below 500 after 8 weeks, and the rebuild conversation starts in earnest. Second, somebody calls with a 2nd round pick or better, which is nearly impossible given that cap number and the current market for interior tackles. Until one of those things happens, Darren Payne should be in Ashburn, wearing number 94, in a 3-4, with Durante Jones designing packages to get the most out of him. A 2027 5th round pick for Darren Payne. Buffalo, with all due respect, and keep that offer. And speaking of players that the DMV understands better than the rest of the country, we need to talk about DYAMI Brown. Because for the past several weeks, I have seen analysis after analysis questioning whether the Commanders have enough at skill positions to compete in 2026. And every single time that question comes up, Brown's name is nowhere in the answer. That bothers me. Let's fix that. DYAMI Brown left Washington last year. He signed a 1-year, $10 million deal with Jacksonville. Good money, earned. This man had 30 receptions, 428 yards, and 3 touchdowns in 2024 with Jaden Daniels in his first season as a starter. In the playoffs, he put up 14 catches for 229 yards across 2 games. That 45-yard bomb against the Lions in the divisional round was not a scheme play. That was Brown getting a step on a single high safety and Daniels putting the ball exactly where only Brown could reach it. That is real trust. That is quarterback to receiver chemistry that you cannot manufacture with a free agent signing. Jacksonville did not use him right. He dealt with a shoulder injury. The season was basically gone, and now he is back in Ashburn. And the people who watched every single rep this spring have something to say. Mitchell Tischler from Monumental Sports Network caught every practice this offseason and landed here. DYAMI Brown is probably your number 2 receiver on this roster right now. Not a guy with potential to be the 2. He is the 2. Now, that is a strong statement from someone who was present every day, and Dan Quinn came out of day 1 of mandatory minicamp and specifically called out Brown, saying he had a good intensity about him from the moment he walked back through the doors at Commanders Park. Dan Quinn does not hand out public praise as a performance. He is methodical and controlled with his words. When he singles out a specific player after day 1 of minicamp, it is because what he is seeing on the field justifies saying it. Now let's get into what Brown actually does tactically, because I think the conversation always stops too short at he's fast. Yes, he is fast. He averaged over 20 yards per reception at North Carolina in his final college season. Everybody knows that. But raw speed alone does not explain why Brown is an offensive multiplier rather than just a deep ball gadget player. What Brown does specifically is change the geometry of a defense before the snap. When a safety has to worry about giving up a step to Brown on a vertical route, that safety cannot position himself 8 yards off the line to help against the run game or fold his zone toward Terry McLaurin. When a corner gives cushion to avoid losing the foot race downfield, Brown converts that space into an intermediate route that moves the chains. You saw this in 2024. The times defenses put extra resources toward McLaurin, Brown was available. The times they focused on Brown, McLaurin had more room to operate. That is what a legitimate vertical threat does. It forces the defense to choose which problem it wants to have. In David Blau's offense, that effect gets amplified. Blau is building a play-action heavy system where Daniels uses his legs and the threat of the run game to create favorable looks in the passing game. When Jackery, Kroski, Merritt, and Rashad White are genuine run threats out of the backfield, the safety who has to come down to defend the run is exactly the safety Brown wants coming down, because when that safety commits downhill, the real estate behind him opens up. And Brown with a step on a corner in open space is a 50-yard gain waiting to happen. The shoulder is the variable to watch. I will be real about that because it would be irresponsible not to mention it. Brown's playing style, the explosion out of his break, the acceleration on the back end of a route, the catch at the edge of his range, all of that depends on the shoulder being fully healthy. Brown said publicly he came back better physically and mentally. Quinn is seeing something in practice that has him talking, but training camp and pads is where that evaluation becomes real. If he gets there healthy and maintains what the spring showed, fam, we are talking about a receiver who can be a top 15 option at his position in the NFC this season. And that changes the national narrative on this skill position group completely. Brown healthy, McLaurin being McLaurin, Antonio Williams with upside, Blau building a system specifically around what Jaden Daniels does best. That is not a poverty offense. That is an offense with real teeth. And the people writing take after take about Washington's lack of weapons are going to need to update their analysis when the season starts. One more thing worth saying that does not get enough attention, what Brown brings back to that receiver room as a veteran who lived the 2024 playoff run. That room has younger players who have never been to January. Brown was there. He caught 14 balls in 2 playoff games. When he opens his mouth in the film room about what preparation looks like for a playoff week, nobody can replicate that voice. That is the kind of invisible leadership that does not show up in box scores, but absolutely shows up when the margin is one possession in week 16. And to close today, I want to talk about something that is not generating as much noise as a trade rumor or an OTA quote, but that is going to matter a lot when Washington opens training camp in July. Will Harris and what he needs to do in this secondary. Harris came to Washington last year on a 2-year, $8 million deal with a max value of $10 million. The signing made sense at the time. A veteran safety, physical, versatile, experienced in the back end of a defense. Exactly what Adam Peters was looking for to add some presence to a secondary that needed it. In week 3 of 2025, playing against Las Vegas, Harris fractured his fibula. That was basically the end of his season, 9 games total. Now he is 30 years old in the final year of his deal with no guaranteed money remaining, and he needs to convince Durante Jones he still has a role in this rebuilt defense. The pressure here is not contractual in the traditional sense. The pressure is that the NFL does not wait for anybody. Washington's secondary is in an active rebuild under Jones. There are younger players in that depth chart who want snaps. But there are cheaper options the front office can look at if Harris does not show up in pads the way Jones needs him to. A 30-year-old safety coming off a fibula fracture with no guaranteed money left on his contract has to make his case immediately when the hitting starts. Now, the argument on the other side is equally real. What Harris brings is exactly what Peters was looking for when he signed him. Back-end versatility, the ability to play both strong safety in the box and deep coverage, and a physicality and run defense that does not come cheap in the free agent market. And that is precisely the safety profile that Durante Jones's 3-4 requires. Think about the scheme for a moment, because it matters here. In a 3-4, safeties are not interchangeable pieces. Jones needs safeties who can process multiple responsibilities based on the opponent's personnel grouping. In 2nd and 1, he needs a safety who comes down in the box and fills the run gap without hesitation. In 2nd and 8 with the opponent in shotgun, he needs that same safety dropping into zone coverage or handling a man assignment on a tight end without losing the defense's communication. Harris has shown that range throughout his career in Detroit and in Washington. The tape from his first 2 weeks of the 2025 season, before the injury, shows a player who can shift between responsibilities without the defense losing structure. That does not get improvised. That comes from years of experience in multiple systems. The key question is whether the fibula cost him lateral quickness. That is what Jones has to evaluate in pads. A safety who lost a step in his lateral reaction cannot execute the same assignments he ran before the injury. And if there is a degradation in mobility, the coaching staff needs to know in July, not in week 1 of the regular season. The evaluation of Harris in training camp is not about whether Peters likes him. It is about whether Harris can still do what this defense needs him to do. If he can, there is a real path to another short-term deal. Because the kind of 30-year-old veteran who understands multiple responsibilities in the back end of a 3-4 and can mentor younger safeties is not easy to replace with a cheap free agent signing. The value Harris brings is not just what he does on the field on game day. play. It is what he does in the meeting room the other 6 days of the week. If he cannot, Peters is not a sentimental general manager. He has spent 2 seasons in Washington proving that roster construction happens through cold analysis, not through attachments. Harris knows that, and if he knows it, he is going to arrive in Ashburn with something to prove. Honestly, that is exactly what you want from a veteran in a contract year. That is everything I have got for today, fam. 3 stories, 3 angles that I think deserve more analysis than they are getting in the general media right now. Buffalo comes in with a 2027 5th-round pick for Darren Payne and expects Peters to pick up the phone. That does not happen. DYAMI Brown is back, healthy, motivated, carrying chemistry with Daniels that no free agent signing can replicate. And Mitchell Tischler is calling him the number 2 receiver on this team after watching every practice rep this spring. And Will Harris has a full training camp to show that the fibula was a 12-month setback, not the end of his time in burgundy and gold. This franchise came out of 2025 at 5-12. Daniels was hurt. The defense gave up the most yards in the entire league. All of that is real, and we have to look at it straight, but it is also real that there is a new defensive coordinator with a scheme that could unlock the best version of Darren Payne. There is a receiver back in the building who Jaden Daniels already knows how to use. And there is a head coach who this week talked about the drift and the danger of complacency in the summer. Like he is already preparing this team to not repeat what happened in 2025. That tells me something about Dan Quinn. It tells me he knows this is not a transition year. This is a response year. Raise hail always. Give this video a like if you made it here, subscribe if you have not, and drop it in the comments. Do you trade Darren Payne if the Bills come back with a 2nd-round offer, or do you run it back with him in Jones's 3-4 and see what comes out? I want to read every answer.